And we let's see, so as we get going here, our next break is at 2. So all right, Katrina, are we good to go? Okay, are we recording?
Yes, we're good and we're recording.
Right. Oh. You know what? Okay, perfect. All right. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a good lunch. So in this segment, we're going to talk a little more directly about how we can help lead a community, a congregation, out of denial and myths into education. So we've mentioned that as a key priority for us as leaders. So a few more words about that, and then we'll dive into how do we think about creating a church that's a safe place for survivors. And so we're raised the issue of trauma and how that impacts many survivors, and leading into how do we care for and become more trauma informed as organizations in our care for survivors. All right. So again, our tool for thinking about effective prevention response in the community, let's talk about education. And then part of survivor care, one way to think of that is in terms of education, understanding survivors and what they experience, understanding trauma as a key part of education that shapes our pastoral care and commitments as a community to care for one another. So effective prevention and response requires us as leaders to lead some people in our communities out of denial, out of myths, and into more education on these areas. Of course, a local community that is in denial about abuse, that abuse is common, that it could happen and does happen, and that it happens over there in those churches, or just thinks, well, abuse would never happen here in my church. It happens in those churches or in those families, but not my church or not my family, not my neighborhood. That sort of mentality, of course, gives a lot of room for those who abuse power to maneuver when it's something that is always seen as happening over there. So now that said, we have to be completely understanding for people. I'll never forget when I was a pastor, I read one day in a major US newspaper about a pastor in my own denomination. He was a worship pastor, and he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse. And news reporters talked to a woman in the congregation. This was her worship pastor who led worship in her church. And she said, look, it's just shocking. It's shocking because it is someone who I thought was good. And so when we talk about confronting denial or helping people in denial, a big part of that is meeting them where they are. And of course, it's shocking when it is someone you know, someone you thought you knew, and someone you care about who is revealed to have abused power. And so that dynamic of secrecy and deception means that, of course, this is where many people are when allegations or disclosures of abuse come to light. Of course, it's shocking. And so we can understand that as leaders. We can help people and assure them. At the same time, when there is a defiant sort of denial, well, I just know that person and I just don't ever believe they could do that. It's on us as leaders to understand that, yes, but to push back, in my view, and using the words of Jesus, that's exactly how it works in a church setting. It's not someone who is openly abusive, openly acting like a ferocious wolf, to use the words of Jesus. The dynamic is that double life that's being lived, a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so in almost all cases of abuse that we are helping churches navigate, that's the dynamic. It's someone in their community, someone who they thought they knew, someone they still care about. And it's a person everyone thought they would never do that. So we can't let that more pernicious type of denial keep us from doing what's right and moving forward, and at times pushing back on forms of denial that are harmful. So we have to work as church leaders to connect the words of Jesus to, again, this present world and the things that are, part of our modern experience and our current experience. In cases of abuse of power that we know of, we have to connect these issues and the words of Jesus and the priorities of Jesus to understand this, and to help people understand we're not calling them to a constant state of paranoia, but we're calling everyone to education and a proper vigilance. So pushing back against denial, pushing back against some myths, and there's no way to name all the myths. But as leaders, it's important for us to be aware of myths that may have impacted our church community. Attitudes like, well, in some churches, maybe, but not our church. Everyone here is lovely. Well, of course, everyone's lovely. and most people are not predatory, and they are genuinely kind and not just nice. So to have that mentality, to understand that, but to say that we do have to be vigilant here. That's an important step. To confront myths like that false reports of abuse are common. They're not common. They're actually the exception, not the rule. Many times church policies I read say we're protecting kids, but we're protecting from false allegations. And the mentality is that those are happening all the time. But that is actually a misunderstanding of the reality. Understanding abuse in terms of, well, if he or she had done this, this wouldn't have happened. Again, which is often something that ends up feeding into victim blaming, which we'll come back to in a moment. Or we hear from church leaders often, well, oh, that's terrible. I wish they had come forward sooner. Well, yes, but that's a very hurtful thing to say typically, because you're basically saying and not understanding how difficult it is for people to come forward, and just understanding more information about abuse and the dynamics. So we'll come back to that question as well. Or that victims just need to quickly forgive and move on, as if the wounds of abuse are not deep wounds. They are very deep wounds to our personhood. It's not a surface wound. We can't just quickly forgive and move on. That's not possible. So understanding some common misguided mentalities surrounding abuse as leaders, working against those is important. And bringing, of course, people into education. The safest community is an educated community. We need to educate all, from leaders to the most vulnerable. And as leaders, we have responsibility for this. So in educating kids, for younger kids, and for parents to get good books and read to their kids, and then in church, in Sunday school or kids worship, to have a few go-to books that we use to give safety talks and talk about our policy and the boundaries, so that the kids know we care very deeply of how you're treated here at our church. We also care how the older kids treat you. We care about how you treat each other and your peers. We care about how you treat younger kids, and so forth. So books like God Made All of Me by Justin and Lindsay Holcomb. Justin is on our board at Grace. I Said No by Zach and Kimberly King. And then one of my other favorites is Let's Talk About Body Boundaries, Consent, and Respect by Janine Sanders. Those are a few examples. There's many other great children's books in these areas. And it's important to think about those major points in books like that for younger kids, and then to use that to give a basic safety talk to youth in the youth group. That's also important. So just giving a simple 10-minute, 15-minute talk at the most, not trying to overwhelm them, but just talking about God's heart and what abuse of power can look like, that you have rules in place and expectations in your church of how the adults should be treating them, how they should treat their peers, how they should treat younger kids, and so forth. And then talking through that we're here to help you. If you, as a youth, are experiencing a boundary violation or something that makes you concerned or uncomfortable, or anyone is crossing and abusing power, that we are here to serve you and help you. And please, as soon as you can, talk to a friend and talk to an adult as quick as you can, get some support. We're going to do anything we can to help you. Just naming those realities and having that direct talk really does make a difference with kids and youth. And then educating adults is key. Many churches have some form of training, and often it's from their insurance company or a company they use to manage screening for their volunteers who work with kids. Everyone watches a video or something like that, and that can be fine and present some good information. What we really want churches and leaders to wrestle with especially is that, again, that limited amount of training for a limited group of volunteers for those who work with kids and youth, that doesn't address education for the whole community. So again, we want to take a community-based approach to prevention. And that means we have to work to overcome and anticipate barriers to educating others and having a training event for the whole community. So for leaders, sometimes we have to realize, okay, if we're going to have training for the whole community, we have to maybe wrestle through some barriers within our leadership team. Like, well, we want to be careful. We don't want to give the impression that abuse is a problem in our church. Okay, I understand that. But we do have to raise that this is a reality that Jesus calls us to proactively work on prevention and protecting others. So we can do that, and without scaring people that, and giving the impression that this is a really major problem in our church community that's happening all the time or something. Again, we can work through that, and we can positively call people and show people why we're working proactively on these areas. And then we can think about the individuals in your church community. I know people in my church, the people in your church, that some of them who don't work with kids are going to struggle coming to a training because they just don't see the connection. Why would I need to go? I don't work with the kids or the youth. I don't serve in the nursery. Why would I have to do a training? Or I don't even know anyone who's been abused. Why do I have to do the training? Certainly, all of us know survivors of abuse, whether or not we know who they are. The sad reality is all of us know those who have abused power. Abuse is statistically common enough that almost certainly that is the case, that we know people who have abused power in various ways, and we know survivors of abuse of power. So, and then of course we have to be sensitive. If someone is, whether they're a survivor or not, if it's just overwhelming for them to come to a training where this is directly addressed, certainly we can be sensitive to that and understand. And many times when we train congregations, if a survivor says, well, I just can't come, I'm just not ready, and our answer is always, of course you don't have to come. You need to care for yourself. And at any point, you can take a break if you do decide to come, and we walk through those self-care techniques. Now, this leads into understanding a deeper mentality related to trauma and more education on trauma that would help us to care well for care for survivors in a way that accounts for trauma and what survivors experience. Now, I've already mentioned SAMHSA, which is, again, the US's our Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And they say, look, when we talk about trauma and becoming a trauma-informed organization, this is what we mean. And they use 4 R's to talk about this. So first, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. So we're going to talk about each of these 4 areas. Of course, we've already been talking about how common abuse is. Not all trauma is related to abuse. But when we expand the category of trauma beyond abuse, you can have trauma. Famously, we know soldiers can have trauma from their experiences. We know people in a terrible car accident or who go through a terrible earthquake can have trauma related to that. And of course, there are other examples. It's likely about half of people in the US will have some traumatic event. Again, not all abuse, but some traumatic event across their lifetime. So this is something that we can, as pastoral caregivers, account for in how we think about pastoral ministry and pastoral care beyond just abuse, but certainly abuse as well. So just recognizing that this is widespread and impacts many people in our congregations is a good starting point. It goes on to say, SAMHSA, we need to get better at recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. So in our church, can we recognize, and we'll come back to, and I'll give you some common signs of trauma in a moment. And then are we responding to trauma by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies and procedures and practices? So in our policies, in our practices, are we thinking about trauma-informed principles in how we care and do pastoral care? Are we thinking about trauma-informed principles? Are we helping the people in our church develop sensitivity to trauma in how we respond? For example, if a friend of ours discloses that they've never told anyone, but when they were a child, this was their experience in their home, and it was an experience of abuse of power. So we'll talk through that in this section. And then finally, are we as the church leading a community where we're understanding what might be re-traumatizing and causing further harm? And so we're going to begin actually with that and talk through how do we think about responding to survivors in such a way that resists re-traumatizing. And of course, that will be taking a posture of belief and support, not blame. And we'll talk through those issues here in a moment. But to me, that's just a wonderful summary. I am going to share the SAMHSA's summary document, Concept of Trauma and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach, along with the slides with all of you, so you can use that document as well. It's just such a wonderful document that coheres and fits so well with our Christian faith priorities and commitments. So when we think about responding to survivors, understanding trauma, and resisting re-traumatization, the key to all of this, again, is God and developing empathy. We saw in Psalm 9 that God never ignores the cries of someone who is being hurt or someone who's being exploited. And for us, that is just so important to remember that this is something God embodies and calls us to embody as well. And certainly we saw this in the ministry of Jesus very powerfully to me when the young man in Luke 10 was seeking to justify himself. And the young man thought he was doing well, a loving neighbor, and he asked Jesus the question, and who is my neighbor? Jesus actually told this story about an assault, the story of the Good Samaritan, and how people responded to the man who was assaulted. And that, to me, is a profound statement by Jesus about what does it mean to love others and care for others and be a loving church community. And that when Jesus is asked about what does it mean to love neighbor and who is my neighbor, that Jesus tells this story about assault. And of course, we know the story that a religious person passes by and does not help. A religious leader passes by and does not help, but the Good Samaritan stops and binds up the man's wounds and takes him to a place where he can receive ongoing medical care and says, in a very moving statement, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Now, all of us have limitations and all churches have limitations, but certainly this is calling us to deep reflection and energy and using of resources to do all we can to help those who have been hurt. And so understanding survivors is really key to minimizing re-traumatization. Let's just walk through a few key questions. And now this will be a good chance for us to have some interaction. And I know it's after lunch, so we need to get the blood flowing a little bit. So if you can get ready to participate and engage on this question, I would really appreciate it. So there are many, many reasons why a survivor of abuse of power might not immediately come forward and talk about their story. Many, many legitimate reasons. So let's just name some of those, because as leaders, we have to help everyone in our community understand why someone wouldn't come forward. In fact, it's normal for disclosure to be delayed, or in fact, for some survivors to never come forward because they're just not ready to do so, and a variety of other reasons. So what are some of the reasons you think of thinking about survivors, and that survivors very often are not able to immediately come forward, if at all? What are some of the reasons why someone might not come forward?
In the chat, it's already saying trust, the fear of not being believed, shame, afraid of being blamed or shamed, embarrassment, won't be believed, fear, shame, protecting abuser because of their power. No one will believe me or they will think it's my fault, fear, shame, fear of rejection, confusion about what happened, reputation, and threats.
Wow.
Being manipulated to believe they're wrong to tell.
Yes. Yeah. And those are some of the main reasons. Well done. Absolutely. And so occasionally when I do have a leader who says something like, oh, I just wish you had come forward sooner, it's important for us to stop that and say, don't say that. And so here's one way that I think about that I've loved telling leaders about. And again, it gets to some of the things that were already said in the chat, but think about it in this way. We're talking about an abuse of power where someone who holds power and trust over someone more vulnerable has violated them in a deeply painful and hurtful way. And now we're saying, oh, just come forward. What are we asking someone to do in that position? We're saying to a vulnerable person who's been hurt, it's okay, it's easy. You just make yourself vulnerable again to people in positions of power and trust, and risk getting hurt and being betrayed again. It's easy, just do it, just come forward. And when you say it like that, it begins to, of course, the leaders understand, oh, maybe I've missed something here. There's obviously something I'm not really understanding in terms of the experience of many survivors. So yes, many survivors, and here's the thing, many survivors experience shame and guilt. And I know survivors who are now adults, they were abused as children. They say, look, Mike, I'm an adult. I know what that adult did to me when I was a child is not my fault. Cognitively, I know it. But it still feels in my body like it was my fault. I feel shame and guilt. And that's exactly it for many survivors. It's one thing to know cognitively it was not your fault. You know, that person there was a power dynamic. They abused power against me, whether I was an adult or a child.
Mike,
it's not my fault. Yes.
We've had a couple more responses, but mostly in this vein. But the one that stuck out is, and using church power to compel someone to tell is also abusing power.
Yes. Yes. Again, we don't press for details if someone discloses and they're not ready to talk about details, and we don't corner someone to talk about their story if they're not ready to do so and come forward, for sure. Yeah. So understanding that is important to avoiding re-traumatization. Now, when we train in churches, very often we get this question, well, wait, are you saying, because advocates will say things like, we take a posture of belief towards victims, or we always believe victims, or it's important that we believe victims. And so what are we saying? Because sometimes the pushback is, but you said that false allegations are not common, but you didn't say they never happen. And that's right, I did not say they never happen. But they are, you know, statistically the minority of cases. And so there are a range of studies that bring back some sort of range, like 92 to 98% of disclosures or allegations are true. When you look at rigorous research, and many child abuse studies bring back like 1 to 2% end up being false. And more, those who work in this field can identify that there are a few common patterns of false allegations. Again, still the vast minority of cases, but those who are investigators, CPS, and social services, they are better at identifying those because, again, we've had some rigorous research in this area. But when someone says we believe victims, or it's important that we take a posture of belief, that is such an important posture. Talking to trauma therapists, many will tell you, look, when someone discloses, it's a watershed moment often in their life. If they, on the one hand, receive skepticism or blame or minimizing, anything like that, it can be a significant setback and be re-traumatizing. On the other hand, on the other side of the watershed, if someone responds with care and support and just listens and says, thank you for telling me that, I am so sorry, that should not have happened to you, that can often be just a monumental moment, a moment of importance on a path of healing and overcoming. So it is very important that, yes, we take a posture of believing. A tool that I like to give leaders is, because often the pushback is, well, isn't someone innocent until proven guilty? You're saying we just assume they're guilty. No, I'm not saying that. What about due process? Okay, notice where those terms come from. I just use those phrases, due process and innocent until proven guilty. Where do those phrases apply? In a courtroom. They apply in a courtroom. In a courtroom, of course, there are rules to serve a process that is seeking to be fair in some sense. But here's the key point. A church is not a courtroom. A church is a community of vulnerable people. When you're having coffee with your friend and they disclose abuse, you're not in a courtroom. You're on an interpersonal level, listening to someone says, I was hurt, I was devastated. And what are we called to do as followers of Jesus in that moment? Of course, we're called to respond with belief. And we're not saying there's not a proper place for things like due process and rules regarding evidence, or things like innocent until proven guilty, other rules that would apply in a criminal courtroom, standards of evidence, and so forth. You can believe in that and honor that, but in a personal conversation in a church community, yes, I believe strongly with all of my heart, we are called to help everyone in our community be prepared to respond to anyone who says, I'm hurting, I was hurt, with belief, with support, with listening. So we'll talk about some of those responses on a practical level here more in just a moment. But to me, that's the key distinction. You're not an investigator, you're not a judge, and you're not a jury in that moment. So when we say believe survivors, believe someone who discloses, that's what we're saying. It's in that interpersonal context, in a church community context, that we're called to take on this mentality. And that's what we're saying. We're not saying in a criminal courtroom that we set aside the US Constitution or something. Again, that's just not what we're talking about. All right, victim blaming. So let's do another conversation, and you can weigh in audibly or in the chat. What are some common forms of victim blaming, or questions or statements that might convey victim blaming, even if we don't intend it? Let's just talk through some examples, because that is very often a common path of re-traumatizing that survivors experience, are in forms of victim blaming. So we want to be aware of that. We want to avoid that. So go ahead. If you want to weigh in audibly, go ahead. If you want to send something in the chat, go for it. What are some of the things that you think of when we think of victim blaming?
So far, the chat already says, why didn't you say no? assuming the victim had some luring power, it was mutual, she shouldn't have been wearing that.
Exactly. Yeah. Good.
Sometimes blaming, if it's a child too, sometimes it's blaming of the parents. Where were the parents?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And certainly that's something we want to have great compassion for and avoid, not just with the victim, but the parents. Yeah, for sure. Many times parents are victimized in some sense as well. And certainly there are parents who have some level of culpability in that they're look the other way. That does happen. But in many cases, if not most, where it's an offender outside the family, parents have no idea. They've been deceived as well. They're a victim in some sense as well.
Somebody,
Yes, other
somebody else
thoughts.
added, are you sure that's happened that way? I'm sure he didn't mean it like that.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, all the classic, what were you wearing? Why were you there? What were you doing when this happened? Um, I would have done this. Why did you do that? um, what were you doing when this happened? Did you text them first? What did you say? Did you initiate a conversation? Did you fight back? Why not? Were you, all of those things. We just have to, in the moment, even if a thought like that enters our mind, we must be ready to not say it. And that can be certainly something that does a lot of damage, and hurt. So just being aware of that. And again, it's on us as leaders to raise and help people understand forms of victim blaming. And we can do that. You all have a grasp of this. You all are very good at articulating this. So just make sure that that's how you do it. Of course, you have to do it carefully. How would you talk through this? How would you help your congregation in this area? That's a harder question, but of course, this is an area as leaders we can be aware of. And then more broadly, many times we experience church leaders who say, well, the victim, whether it's a teenager, a kid, an adult, they acted this way. And that just didn't seem credible to us that they were behaving in this way. And so their disclosure, we didn't really think was credible because they were acting in this way or that way. And many times leaders, again, it's often just a failure of empathy or the mentality of, I would have done this and they didn't do that, so I don't really take this seriously or believe them. And we must avoid this this pitfall as leaders. What we know now about trauma is that victims of abuse and those experiencing trauma behave in a whole range of ways. And people like to talk about, well, it's a fight or flight response when we're scared or when there's some sort of threat. And yes, fight or flight, but that's reductionistic. It's not fight or flight. Freeze is very common. And so just because someone didn't fight back or say no or run away or attempt to do something, look, and it's not something we have control over. Your body just responds and freezes for many of us in a situation of fear, of threat. And that's a very common response. And no one is to blame for that type of response. And beyond freeze, fawning is common, where you're simply compliant because you're afraid if you are not, something worse even that is already happening could happen. And those are not the only four choices either. There are just a range of behaviors that are common for survivors to demonstrate. But many times the injury, like mental injury, depression, anxiety, some of the things a survivor is experiencing are used to discredit the survivor in the community. And very often we are able to tell leaders, no, that actually gives credibility. This shift in behavior in this child is actually a point that argues that something did happen. And the same with adults as well. So just being aware of that, helping everyone in the community understand that just because it doesn't make sense to us doesn't mean that that necessarily should be used at all to discredit a person.
Hey, Mike, in the
Yes.
chat room,
Yeah.
someone said a lot of pronouns used here give the impression that the abuser is always male. Shouldn't we be aware that the abusers can be male and or female?
Yes, and that's a good point. Statistically, the vast majority of offenders are male, and that's probably something I could have clarified at the beginning, so I apologize for that, but a very good point. And a lot of the stories we've used, although not all, the one main scenario we used is making us aware that abuse is often same gender, not always. So, you know, opposite gender. So look, it is something that it's not that there are not female offenders. There are. The vast majority of offenders are male. And that makes sense when you think about the things that feed into abuse of power, like having power to begin with, having entitlement, and attitudes of entitlement that are often driving offending behavior. It's not that, you know, women who have power have never abused it. Of course, that has happened. And many males and females who have been victimized by a female are much, and because of societal views and norms, very often are more reluctant to talk about the offending they experienced from a female. So there are female offenders, and many survivors of female offenders. It still stands though that the vast majority of offenders are male. So that's a good point though. Thank you. Now we've been using this word trauma, and I'm not a professional trauma therapist, but many in our organization are professionals in this area. And so I like to give sort of a layperson understanding of trauma that can help some of us. And some of you, I'm sure, already have some training or even professional knowledge of this area. I'm going to use an illustration from the Surgeon General of California, adapt an illustration from her, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, to help us just make the simple point about what trauma is on a lay level. Imagine yourself walking down a street, and you come across past a building and down kind of a side street or an alley. You know, whether you're in a big city or a small town, just wherever you are, imagine. Imagine you come to that side street or alley, and all of a sudden around the corner, there is a big, large, threatening dog growling at you, baring its teeth, and the hair on the back of its neck standing up. Just start to think about what are some of the things that would begin to happen in your body physiologically in that situation. Okay, it's not a hypothetical. Let's go ahead. What would start to happen in your body in that situation, would you say?
Your heart's going to begin to pound.
Yes, your heart is going to start pounding. What else?
One says adrenaline, fear, fight or flight, adrenaline rush.
Yes. Very likely you might have adrenaline. You're going to have adrenaline released into your bloodstream. You might have other things like cortisol, stress hormone released, things like that. And your brain, let's say you were walking down the street thinking about, you know, your summer plans, vacation, or what you were going to get at the market on the way home. And so in your cognitive planning part of your brain, executive functioning, you were thinking about that. Are you going to be thinking about that at this moment once you see the dog? Almost certainly not. Your part of your brain that is going to be activated and blood is going to go to is the part of your brain that's in charge of keeping you safe and alive and responding to threats. So that part of your brain is going to be engaged, and a lot of your executive cognitive functioning, higher level functioning is not going to be as prominent. And that's all normal. And we have systems in our bodies that are designed to ramp up and keep us safe and meet threats like that. So you can make a quick decision and duck into a doorway or run or fight or something else. Yes. So God created us with bodily systems to keep us safe and respond to danger. God also created us with systems that are designed to calm us down after a threat and bring us back to a state of rest and of calm. And so we could focus and do something and do other things that are, more executive functioning, like planning or thinking ahead, that aren't just worried about the moment. So what happens with trauma is, though, that our brains are doing amazing things and our bodies are doing amazing things to protect us, the brain can get stuck in that stress response or that fear response. And our body can have those stress hormones or adrenaline coursing through our veins, even if there's not a threat, because of how we're having a hard time regulating and calming down and getting back to a kind of a more of a baseline rest where we're calm. And so trauma can disrupt those regulatory processes. And so you can have a child in math class taking a math test, and there's no threat, but because of the trauma, if it's triggered, they have adrenaline in their system and stress hormones, and they're thinking there's a threat. And by the way, if a child that's the case, are they going to do very well on that math test? Of course not. They're not. Someone at work who has to focus on a specific task, if they're triggered, if they're in that stress response, if that breaks in out of the blue and is triggered, they're not going to be able to focus very well on their work at that moment. And it might take a while. And so those stress hormones can actually remain in a survivor's system. And again, it's not just abuse survivors, it's anyone can have trauma from other sources. You can have those stress hormones or adrenaline. If it's triggered, you can have that terror of that past breaking unexpectedly into the present. So just being aware of that is important. And so being aware of certain common symptoms of trauma is an important reality. And especially for those of us who are in charge of pastoral care, and recognizing that, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here for a specific type of support, and maybe also knowing our limits, referral, to help someone gain access to some trauma-informed mental health care. So nightmares, common symptoms of trauma would include things like nightmares and sleep trouble, including bedwetting in children who have outgrown it, fear or terror, like having flashbacks or panic attacks, or fear of a specific person or situation, something that's triggering fear in a specific situation, sharp changes in behavior. Depression and anxiety very commonly are linked to trauma, higher rates in those who've experienced trauma, acting out sexually, behavior problems like defiance, or hyperactivity. And by the way, none of that's intended to be judgmental. A child who's defiant because their body is telling them that's a threat, I'm not trying to give any kind of judgment in that situation. They're often just responding the only way they know how, because their body is telling them, I have to fight right now. I have to fight right now to keep myself safe. And then, of course, self-harm is often connected to trauma, cutting, eating disorders, and suicide. And sometimes there are little to no outward symptoms of trauma. Everyone's different. Everyone's experience is different. It is the case that the majority of abuse survivors are symptomatic at some point in their life, but not always. And I've talked to survivors who've told me, like, I don't have depression. Is something wrong with me? No, I'm glad you don't have depression. That's really good. But also don't be hard on yourself if it doesn't manifest until later in life. And that's okay. Just be aware of that. So just being aware of these. And of course, none of this is conclusive that it's definitely connected to abuse, or you can have depression and anxiety from other causes. And all of us, we're complicated. So just being aware of this, it might is helpful. And again, I just think when I was a pastor, people would often reach out to say, Mike, I want to talk about something hard. Can I come talk to you? And the answer is, of course, yes. But let's say someone drops by my office. A guy says, Mike, I want to talk. Okay, come on over. And he sits down in my office and says, well, I'm having a problem with my spine. Now, what would I do in that situation? I would not clear off my desk and say, all right, man, get up here and let me dig in there and kind of see if I can tell what's going on. Believe it or not, my seminary did not prepare me to give chiropractic, exams or understand the spine. And so we must, as pastoral caregivers, whether we're clergy or lay leaders, whatever our role is, we help support people, but we also have to know our limits. We have to recognize our limits. And a really important practice for churches and for us as leaders is to seek out, where are the trauma-informed professional resources in my community? What's here? What's available? How can I facilitate people who have trauma symptoms access that care, that mental health care that is trauma informed? And so it's never all or nothing. It's never, we only do counseling in the church. Look, I can't counsel. I'm not trained to responsibly help someone with their panic attacks, because there's physiological issues, there's medical issues involved that I am not trained for. It's not responsible for me. What I can do is support someone in the midst of that experience, and in a trauma-informed way, which we'll talk about in a moment. So it's a both and. We want to place a high priority on knowing our trauma-informed resources. And sometimes it's a matter of, we don't have many practitioners in the area. Sometimes it's expensive and a person can't pay for it. Can we help with that? So issues of access in a variety of ways. Hopefully we as a church are sensitive to that and can help with that. A very well-known book that I'm sure some of you have heard of is a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's on trauma, by Bessel van der Kolk. And he says this in the book: social support is a biological necessity, not an option. And this reality should be the backbone of all prevention and treatment. Now, here's what we can do in the church. Many of us are not professional trauma practitioners. However, in the church, can we be a community of support? Absolutely, we can. And that is essential. So Grace is not telling you today, just point people to trauma-informed therapists and send them on their way and you're done. No, it's both and. We are social beings. That's how we're made. And it's a biological necessity. That's how God made us. We need each other. We need community. And so every human, not just survivors of abuse, every human, our nervous systems as social beings are seeking safety and connection constantly, especially survivors, because of how abuse has disrupted safety and disrupted connection. So even a one-on-one, calm, non-judgmental support, just sitting with someone and chatting and being there in a non-judgmental way can actually, we know from research, actually can help a person's nervous system begin to regulate. So though we value trauma-informed professionals, we don't underestimate the power that we have as a caring individual and as caring communities to sit with a survivor in a way that is incredibly beneficial and helping them in powerful ways. And the document I've mentioned more than once now from SAMHSA, that, again, I'm going to be sending to you talks about trauma-informed principles. And some of the main trauma-informed principles, number one, we've already mentioned, which is safety. Just being aware of these will help our pastoral care practices. And it's not just these things are not just helpful for survivors, they're helpful for any human and should shape how we care for one another in every way. So the reality of trauma-informed principles, of course, is directly connected to how abuse or trauma disrupts and harms. So that's one way to think of it. In abuse, safety is assaulted and disrupted. And so we have to make that our priority as we interact with a survivor. Is, you know, whether we know, and many survivors you'll interact with, you'll never know they are a survivor. They will not tell you that. So making safety a priority in how we interact with others is important. So we recognize the power we hold. Now, I told you I'm 6'8". I am very sensitive to how close I stand to people. And it's, you know, I don't give hugs. If someone doesn't make it very obvious, they would appreciate that. And if I'm in any doubt, I ask. And I'm just very aware, because I'm big, how close I'm standing to people. I do not want to get in the way of them experiencing and having a sense of physical safety. And so for any survivor in our ministry, if we do know they are a survivor, a question we can ask: is there anything we can do to help you feel safe in our space, in our church? Is there anything practically we can do for that? Is there anything that's triggering to you especially? And maybe they experienced abuse in their home connected to in their Christian home growing up. Okay, well, there might be some spiritual triggers there that we could help avoid. And then safety is not just physical. Safety is also spiritual and emotional and psychological. So we want to work on being a Christian church community where it is safe for a survivor to articulate their struggle with spirituality because of their abuse. It's okay for them to talk about doubting God or wrestling with God or wrestling with spiritual questions or practices. It's safe to articulate that here. You can articulate that here and not be judged, because this is not just a physically safe space for you. We want it to be spiritually safe. So if you are, if you are struggling, you can articulate that. We're not going to judge you. Dignity. So of course, abuse is a direct assault on someone's dignity, basic human dignity. So for us to recognize in our role as leaders, we can text or email someone or reach out and say, I was thinking about you. How are you doing? Realize what that can convey in terms of the value that someone holds. You are important. You matter. I'm checking on you because you matter. Can we sit and talk? Would you like to do that? Because you matter. And affirming someone's value and dignity and worth, not just with words, but in practical ways, by making time for them or other ways, that is so vital, because abuse, again, is a direct assault on that. Agency is important. We're made as agents by God to live our lives, to make decisions. And it's unhealthy environments that are controlling very often that are taking away agency. And then certainly in abuse, there isn't a direct attack on the will of another to render them powerless. And so to promote agency and a healthy retaking of agency in the survivor's life. So many survivors come to Grace and say, what should I do? Should I leave my church? Should I do this? And our role is not to say, wow, that sounds terrible. You should do that. That's not helpful. They need to decide how they're going to respond in ways that prioritize their health and their mental health. Now, we will validate, we will encourage, we will support, but we will never put ourselves, and healthy pastors never put themselves in a place of telling a survivor what decision they should make with their own life. We can give wisdom, we can give support, but we should very much be trying to encourage and empower them to take agency in their life. So if a survivor says, I'm sorry, Pastor, I'm struggling, and I'm struggling getting to church and feeling safe. Is it okay if I have to miss Sundays occasionally for my mental health? And the pastor, a trauma-informed pastor, will say, of course, you have to prioritize your health and your mental health. And if that's what you need to do for your safety, if that's the decision you need to make to prioritize your own safety as you heal and recover, that's a wonderful thing. And God understands very well, and I understand very well. And that's a great decision. So we can encourage and support in a way that helps them take back that agency. And then, of course, trust is violated in a deep way in abuse. So for us as pastors and leaders to prioritize trustworthiness, I've noticed in many unhealthy church cultures and environments, there is an emphasis by leaders on trust us. You need to trust us. And I know you were betrayed in the past, but you need to trust us now, because we didn't betray you, and you just need to get over that and trust us. Leaders that heavily focus on a message of just trust us, again, to me, that's often a symptom that is unhealthy. There's an unhealthy environment there. Godly, healthy leaders shouldn't need to say, trust us. They should, by their actions and words, be establishing a ground record that they are worthy of trust. And you don't have to say it, because everyone knows it. We are trustworthy. We are here for you. Our actions match our words, and we are not going to betray you. So that's something that we have to, telling survivors, you just need to get over that. You just need to trust people. I know you were hurt, but you need to move forward, and you can't live your life without trusting anybody. Again, that's just typically not the type of mentality or talk that is helpful. Basic responses. I believe you. I'm so sorry. This was not your fault. If they're wrestling with that question, especially, that shouldn't have happened to you. Thank you for telling me that. Just a basic posture of support. You don't have to be perfect. No survivor expects you to be perfect. You just have to show, I really do genuinely care. And Paul's famous words, weep with those who weep. So harmful responses, again, we've covered these already, but these are here in the slides just for good measure. It's just critical to focus on staying calm and listening. It's critical in that moment to not try to fix it or give spiritual platitudes or a sermon or a Bible verse. It's okay. Just sitting with them, sitting with a person, giving them space to talk and tell what they want to tell, and taking a posture of support, and just very few words of support, and just being there, sitting with them in that hard moment is important. I did ask a trauma therapist once, and I'll never forget her words. I said, just on a practical level, what can someone do for a survivor in that moment of disclosure? And she said, look, one of the most important things you can do is just sit and make sure they have space to express whatever emotions, strong emotions often they're feeling, whether it's anger or confusion or grief or betrayal, whatever it is. If you just make space and validate those strong emotions, that's incredibly helpful and healthy. When we push and down and suppress emotions, especially strong emotions, and hold them in our body, it will harm us. It will. The healthier practice is to process through and work through those emotions. And for us to make space and simply validate that, to me, it's directly connected to that verse from Paul, weep with those who weep, or so many Psalms of lament. That's what laments are very often connected to. It's here is an expression of pain, and we're going to process through our pain together as individuals and as a community. The most common form of psalm, by far, when you categorize psalms, are psalms of lament. And many of them are connected to contexts of oppression and exploitation. And so God understands that we need to express confusion and grief and anger, even directed at God. And God never says, "How dare you say that about me? How dare you doubt me?" God says, "Of course you feel that way." And God encourages us to express that. That's why we have so many Psalms of lament. And of course, the message and example of Jesus and the whole good news of the incarnation is that God does not leave us on our own, but God enters into our world, enters into our pain and suffering, and comes to be with us and help us. And that's something certainly we can embody with survivors. So here's a couple summary slides. At this point in the afternoon, I'm not going to read every word, but one more important caveat, and that we maybe haven't said directly, is, we've said we don't press for details about the abuse. It's often not important that they articulate the exact details. Many trauma therapists now know this. To help the trauma, you don't necessarily even need to talk through certain key details. And certainly as pastors or church leaders, pressing for details. Now, if they want to share details, that's fine, but we don't press for details. And certainly we do not urge them to meet with their abuser out of some Christian sense of, well, you have to meet and reconcile. You have to meet and tell them you forgive them. That is very often re-traumatizing. And many Christians say, well, but Matthew 18 says, in another part of Matthew 18 that we didn't talk about earlier, that if you have an issue of sin or conflict with your brother or sister, you go to them directly. And it says there, right there in the Bible, that's how you handle it. Okay, I understand that verse, but in our view, that verse is not giving direction for how we respond to abuse. That verse or those verses are talking about a situation of more interpersonal sin or conflict amongst Christian brothers or sisters. And it envisions where those brothers or sisters have a relative equal power. That's what Jesus is talking about. And when I was a pastor, I would love that issues like that could be resolved and there could be reconciliation. But it's just not talking about crimes, egregious abuses of power, or power differentials. And I'll illustrate it to you. Jesus never said, if a wolf violates a lamb, step one, send the lamb back to the wolf. That's ridiculous. We all know that's incredibly hurtful and harmful, and that is irresponsible. In fact, Jesus said the opposite in John 10. He said, you don't let that wolf get anywhere near those vulnerable sheep. And so we have to account for the whole teaching in a more nuanced view from the whole Bible. So again, in our view, that verse in Matthew 18 about go to your brother or sister is not about abuse of power. It's not about more egregious sins like crimes. And it's very important that we don't utilize that because many who do abuse power love to use that verse to control and continue to maintain power over someone who is powerless or more vulnerable. So in summary, we believe victims. We take practical steps to establish safety. We create space for strong emotions. We don't judge people for struggling with coping behaviors. Look, I don't want a teenager to abuse alcohol, but I'm not going to focus on their alcohol abuse if I have a chance to minister to them, because I know the root of what led to that. I'm going to praise them that you survived. You survived. And that's amazing. It's incredible. And I'm here to support you. And of course you're struggling and trying to simply survive with certain coping mechanisms. So we have to be aware of that and not stigmatize coping mechanisms. We want to encourage agency and protect the privacy of survivors. And that's, again, to trustworthiness. If someone opens up about their story, you don't just tell the whole leadership group without getting their permission before you talk about that. Well, I just wanted all of our leaders to pray for you, so I told them. Well, ask their permission and see if they are ready for that to be shared with a broader group. Give them agency over that. That's important. All right, questions about care for survivors, how we relate that to trauma. Anything, especially, anything, of course, questions you want to share at this point, or thoughts, please. And then certainly any questions, feel free.
I wanted to actually add something.
Mhm.
When people are abused, especially when it's repeated abuse, they kind of become accustomed to their boundaries being pushed. And so they have formed, like the habit of minimizing their own experience.
Mhm.
So sometimes when people will share what has happened to them, they will, maybe share it and then just try to minimize it and change the subject.
Mhm.
So I do, like, everything you're saying is correct with, like making the space for them to share, but
Yeah.
also, like, if they have shared, sometimes they need encouragement to not
Yeah.
rush past that and to
That's
like
right.
allow themselves to feel in that moment.
Yes. Very wise. Amen. And a way people rush past it, there's actually a term now people use a lot, more and more, called spiritual bypassing, where you're not sitting in and working through like the strong emotions we talked about, but you're using a spiritual idea because it's uncomfortable to kind of quickly move past it. That can be something that we do or the survivor does, but you're absolutely dead on with that. It makes me think of a very powerful story that Bessel van der Kolk tells in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And he says, look, he told a survivor that, this was not your fault. And the survivor said, yeah, of course I know, but I'm telling you that it still feels like my fault. And when you tell me it's not my fault, that just makes me feel even more alone, because it makes me think you will never understand what it's like to know that it's not my fault, but to have it still feel like it's not my fault. So even when we correct a survivor on something like that, we have to just be so careful and recognize that it's not just about correct thinking. And the comment that was just made that was so profound, that's absolutely the case very often. I think most often I've seen that with survivors or victims in the midst of intimate partner violence. Because in an intimate partner violence, let's say it's an abusive husband abusing a wife, and the abusive husband has created a whole reality. And in his reality that she lives in, he is entitled to be treated a certain way. He determines everything. He controls everything. And he minimizes and excuses his abusive behavior. Many victims in that setting, when they first start to talk about it, they don't even talk about or think of what they're experiencing as abuse. And if someone calls it that, they immediately react and say, no, my husband's not an abuser. I'm just talking about how this is, we're struggling in our marriage, or, that, this is an area we're working on, or we need to work on. Many survivors in that reality, shaped by the abuser, full of cognitive distortions, essentially, they will argue with you. They will argue with you that what they've experienced is abuse, and they'll downplay it. And today's training is not focusing on the details of like intimate partner violence. And so we're limited in our ability to go into those details. But certainly, and like the comment that was just made, it's not only true in intimate partner violence. Certainly, it's the case for any type of abuse of power where there's that distortion and twisting of reality by the abuser. And many are impacted by that. So I appreciate that comment very much. Thanks. Something else someone wants to add, or?
Mike,
Yeah.
somebody asked in the chat window, is the approach different with marital abuse or rape? I think you just discussed briefly that. Is there anything else you want to add there? And then there's a couple more comments in the chat.
So, right. With any kind of there's certain major distinctions we can make and issues of response. We can make some distinctions with children and with adults, and then within various types of abuse. Because every situation is unique in some sense, and yet there are patterns and things that have to be accounted for in any type of abuse of power. We're going to focus on in the next segment, when we talk about response, the primary issues being issues of safety and accountability and so forth. Certainly though, child abuse, we would take a very strong stance that the first thing you do with any evidence or disclosure of child abuse or reasonable suspicion is that it's reported to the appropriate agency outside of the church. That's not the case with intimate partner violence. The victim for intimate partner violence is when it's an adult, certainly. You don't immediately report. That could put her in greater danger. You work on a safety plan, and you work on empowering her and being an emotional anchor and support. And then, with other forms of adult abuse, there are difficult questions about response. And we've had these cases where there's an assault. It's an adult who's a victim. They went on a date. They were assaulted on the date. What do we do when that information comes to us as church leaders? Well, that's an allegation of a crime. And yet, if the adult who experienced that is not willing to report it to law enforcement, then what do we do? And that's a hard situation to navigate. I think it has to be said, again, in that situation, we must remember as leaders, we are not a courtroom. We are a community of full of vulnerable people. And so trauma-informed principles mean we have to assess safety if we have that information. We can't wait for an adult victim to report it themselves to law enforcement before we act on issues of safety. And we have a tension very often between an individual victim and what they need and what we would view as the needs of the whole community. And those are in tension very often. Let's say if the adult victim is not wanting to report it to law enforcement and seek any kind of external accountability, because let's face it, very often our systems are not trauma informed and not easy for a victim to navigate. And so it's quite understandable that someone wouldn't want to subject themselves to that. So we'll come back to issues of response, and we'll give some basic guidance, but in many cases, churches need to have ahead of time, hopefully, some experts they can reach out to and get help with certain cases. You're just not going to expect, it's not a realistic expectation that you are going to be able to have, even after an in-depth training, all of the knowledge you need to address every situation. That's just not realistic. So yeah, a few thoughts, but we'll come back to that issue also. All right, we are at our next break, which is 2. So let's take our 10-minute break. So I've just set my timer for 10 minutes. See you in 10 minutes.